Welcome to the Afterspin, opinions from thought leaders in our state. I want to ask John Hood and Chris Fitzsimon. The U.S. Fifth Circuit Court of Appeals is hearing a case right now where a federal judge in Texas declared the Affordable Care Act unconstitutional. As might be expected, President Trump is wanting the appellate court to sustain that Texas judge's ruling. However, attorneys general from many states, including North Carolina's Josh Stein, are wanting it overturned, saying the U.S. Supreme Court's already ruled it constitutional. What's your expectation from this Fifth Circuit hearing, John?
Well, there might be an argument for what Josh Stein and others are saying, but the argument you cited is silly. The U.S. Supreme Court concluded that it would have been unconstitutional for Congress to order people to buy private health insurance, but that sort of retroactively, this was Justice Roberts' position, that if you think about it as a tax if you don't buy health insurance, then that is constitutional because Congress has taxing power. Well, Congress has subsequently gotten rid of the tax. So now, if there is a command in the Affordable Care Act, it is unconstitutional according to the U.S. Supreme Court. So when Josh Stein and others say they've already ruled it constitutional, it's like they didn't even read the decision. Now, there is a better line of inquiry than what he's saying, which is basically it doesn't matter. In other words, if the mandate exists but there is no enforcement of it because there's no fine or tax, then it doesn't really matter and it doesn't affect the other parts of the Affordable Care Act, which are actually still operating, particularly Medicaid expansion. I'm not a fan of any of the Affordable Care Act. I would like to start over with it. I think a better argument to defend it right now is not to say the Supreme Court already decided it, because the Supreme Court is on the side of the judge.
In Texas.
Right.
Yeah.
What they ought to argue is essentially the rest of the bill could live without the mandate.
Chris, this thing could get really dicey here. If this court declares it's unconstitutional and there's no stay put on their decision, it's going to obviously go up to the Supreme.
Right. There would have to be a stay. I think with the Supreme, if this court upholds that ruling, it probably will go to the Supreme Court either way, but it certainly would go quickly, I think, if this court upheld the Fifth Circuit. I was interested when this judge made this ruling. There were liberal and conservative legal scholars that said this ruling doesn't make a lot of sense given the state of the law, the state of the state of the tax, all those things, and that they were going to be surprised. On the other hand, the Fifth Circuit appears to, at least from their questions, conceivably to uphold that judge, which will mean it'll be back in John Roberts' lap, and it becomes a political issue as much as a policy issue. I don't think Josh Stein and those guys are arguing the court has already ruled on this issue. It is true the court has already held that the ACA overall is constitutional. This is another aspect of that. I think the Supreme Court will find the same thing. I actually also think Republicans in their offices with the doors closed are hoping this court doesn't overturn it, and that the Supreme Court, or that eventually it's not overturned.
Is that because it is popular with the voting public of North America?
Well, health care, the most important issue in a lot of polls remains health care, and that's what you saw, I think, in the 2018 midterms. It is not a stretch of the imagination to say, or of rhetoric to say to people, okay, now there are no pre-existing conditions are no longer protected and all those things. The Republicans had a chance to come up with their own plan when they controlled Congress and the White House and couldn't do it. So I think there's a lot of this will be the defining issue of the next election if the court turns it over.
Let's just play this out here a little bit. Let's assume that ultimately the Supreme Court rules it's unconstitutional. Some 20 million Americans are going to be without health insurance. In North Carolina, I think it's something like close to 1 million. What's going to happen, John, with all these people?
The Congress would have to reinstate some version of it with pre-existing condition
coverage. Well, they couldn't agree on anything.
I know, but now they'd have to, because the alternative would be nothing. It was harder to come up with something when there was already a policy in place. With no policy in place, I think there'd be a lot of pressure on the Democratic House and the Republican Senate. But just to be clear about this, let's remember that most of the Affordable Care Act had nothing to do with exchanges, nothing to do with it was Medicaid expansion. That is the primary purpose of the bill. I don't like Medicaid expansion, but it's not mandatory. Does not rest on the individual mandate in order to exist. There's not really much dispute that if Congress wants to expand Medicaid or provide an opportunity for states to expand Medicaid, they can do that. So I don't actually think the Supreme Court will rule that unconstitutional.
Do you think the Congress can actually get its act together enough to pass anything?
Well, I don't know. We'll see. I guess I hope we don't have to see in this case. We haven't seen that happen.
It'll be after the 2020 election before anything happens.
It will be the dominant issue if that happens. I still don't think that's going to happen. I do, as I mentioned before, the Republicans had a chance. They couldn't provide anybody with an alternative. They couldn't repeal Obamacare when they controlled all three, the House and the Senate and the White House. John McCain's famous vote
President Trump says he's got a plan.
Yeah, well, he said he had a plan before, and we've never seen it. He said he had a plan when he was going to run. He said he had a plan when they were debating that. He says he has a plan now. I'm not sure.
The plan is on one side of a card, and the 200 communists in the State Department are on the other side of the card, and we will eventually see this card.
But we digress. Thank you for watching the After Spin. We'll have more video all during the week on ncspin.com.